Well, thanks for having me. It's actually always a great pleasure for me to speak at events like this. It's such a learning experience, and it forces me to put the work that I do into a much broader context. It's really, really useful. It's valuable. So I've been listening, and my congratulations as well to the both of you for this chair, and to UNESCO for making this investment, which you'll see through my talk is of great value. I come to you from the School of Climate Studies, which is designed to be a transdisciplinary entity. And as such, I realize now, being in this context, it is an intercultural entity. So transdisciplinarity is intercultural. And I see it every day. I have to spread myself across multiple entities in the university. I have to work with people. Well, I don't have to. I enjoy working with people from different faculties, and the school is designed to integrate and to build relationships. And the cultural difference between faculties is very, very interesting. And it should be that way, because if it were not that way, I guess it wouldn't reflect the mindset and the skills and the competencies of people in each of those faculties. I on a day-to-day basis, I come face to face with cultural differences at the coalface at a small scale. And you see what plays out: power dynamics, control of resources, control of processes. A new school like the School for Climate Studies. I've leaned on my ecological background to understand the process, and whenever a new animal is introduced into the Serengeti, what do the other animals think? This is either a predator. Well, it's not either. This could be a predator. It could be prey. It could be a parasite. It could be a competitor. The last thing people think about is it could be a mutualist. And actually, it's sad to me that this is the case. So this is a battle that I'm having in Stellenbosch University, is to try and encourage the other entities to see the School for Climate Studies as a mutualist and as a cultural connector, let's say. Having been here today, I want to start using that. So I've learned a lot so far. I just want to say that we have a 90-minute lunch break, so I'm sure we can bleed a little bit into lunch, to be honest. This is anyway, up to you. I want to reflect, having listened to a lot of people. Listening to Prof. Hester, she talked about Abraham Lincoln, and I've got a quirky ear. I heard Abraham LinkedIn, and I thought, oh, that's quite cool. 600 years of cultural evolution in the US, represented by those two words, Abraham LinkedIn. But culture is always evolving. Which brings me to my particular topic. And I'm so glad that you've highlighted climate and climate change as a major issue. Climate change is an extraordinarily multicultural issue that plays out on our lives and is playing out right now on our lives. I don't know if any of you watch YouTube, but the scenes in China are extremely disturbing. You don't see it on mainstream media for some reason. Anyway, so let's think about towards a better future for Africa in the context of climate change. I want to start at I'm a scientist, so I like to bring the audience along with pictures and slides, but to illustrate points. But The first point I want to make is that Africa is often seen as a basket case, and it's such a short-term and silly view, because Africa, particularly Southern Africa, it's not a basket case. We're on the rise, and I put a graph up here of the GDP growth in Southern Africa as a total, South Africa and some of the Southern African countries. We're not going backwards. Well, South Africa slightly, but it probably in a good way, energy-wise, sustainability-wise. And if you look at the population growth rate, and Sarah, you mentioned this, the growth rates in Southern Africa are decreasing. In fact, the whole world is involved in a major slowdown with regard to population growth. This could well be another crisis. We see it playing out in China and other countries. We're running out of young people. So I think the youth bulge in Southern Africa is one of the few places in the world where we have young people as a resource. Our politics seem to somehow have missed this. And so we have 30-40% unemployment in South Africa. It's entirely a policy choice and entirely avoidable. But I can talk about those economics at another stage. But falling population growth rates, but a very healthy young population, rising GDP. We're not a basket case. We are a place of future global growth and skills if we manage it correctly. We're also, I'm sad to see that some of the colors aren't coming out on the slide, but we're one of the parts of the world with the fastest urbanization rate, undergoing some of the fastest cultural shifts relating to deruralization and urbanization, which for a better future in this part of the world has to be understood and managed better. Otherwise, disaster will follow. Urbanization, our land use trends are also very, very interesting. If you look in Southern Africa, we have two major areas of land use, very intensive land use to the northeast of that dotted line, and much less intensive land use to the southwest. Africa's not a monolith. There are regional, national, major differences in the way development is playing out. And it is just wrong to think of the African problems. Every country has a unique blend and mix of opportunities, threats, problems, and issues. And hopefully this chair will be able to really start to, or increasingly highlight that. So having put this in a local land use context, and from a climate perspective, I think land and food are one really, really critical element that we need to focus on. So I'm going to look at that a little bit. When thinking about the future, what is a better future for Africa involve? We need to ask the right questions, and we need to engage with the right knowledge to understand this. So here is a graph which I'm calling cultural contrasts in land use decision making. And what I'm showing you is a fairly recent paper which looks at iconic land use types or land use decision-making types. This is really important for us to understand, I think. It's a different way. It's a global view, but what the study does is it says, let's look at iconic types like professional intensifiers, people who professionally intensify land use in red, subsistence smallholders, market smallholders, professional commercial. You can see all the types of land use decision makers. Now, land use decision makers have a huge impact on the future evolution of the food security and human welfare and human livelihoods, job opportunities, developmental scenarios and trajectories in a country and in a region. We need to understand this. And, somebody might say, well, I'll put a dotted line across the map and I'll say, well, north of that line, the global north, we're full of professional intensifiers and professional eco-agriculturalists and eco-agriculturalists, highly commercial. And that divides the global north from the global south. That might be one view. Somebody else might say, well, we can put 2 lines on this map, and we can divide a temperate, highly intensive agricultural zone and a tropical and subtropical, less intensive smallholder zone. And it's driven by climate. It's not cultural, or it's cultural driven by climate. What's true? What's correct? Do we know? We, as African scientists and African academics, need to engage with questions like this from our own perspectives and help to drive an Africa-appropriate development trajectory that suits us, that is good for us. Africa often has ideology and culture imposed upon it, more often than not. I was just thinking at some of these talks, we heard, I lived through the 60s and 70s, what was called the Cold War. That was not a Cold War here in Africa. It was a hot war. The war was fought here in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's culturally misappropriated. Oh, it's a Cold War. No, for us it was not. So we've got to build our own capacity to start to understand these sorts of things. Because if you look at what's happening in South America, you can see the professional intensification creeping up into the Amazon, into the South American savannas, destroying ecosystems on the altar of beef production for American hamburgers. It hasn't happened here yet, but the plans are afoot. And for a better future for Africa, we need to understand these things in conjunction with what's been going on elsewhere in the world. I just wanted to make the point that, in essence, our new culture as modern humans is that we farm the world. The world has become our farm. The oceans have become our playground and our fish pond. This is what has happened to mammal biomass from 100,000 years ago, when we were a small rapacious bands of people desperately hanging on to survival. And now we have decreased natural mammal biomass from several tens of millions down to 3 million tons, and replaced it with our biomass and the biomass of our livestock. We farm the planet. We have enormous control over planetary conditions, but we've let it get out of control, as I'll show you. So that is a massive cultural shift, and it's backed by a massive ecological shift. And what is the ecological shift? We now appropriate 1/3 or more of the net primary productivity of the planet to our own use, both through destruction of land and land use change, goes up into the atmosphere, and through harvest, leaving maybe 60%, maybe less, behind for natural ecosystems. That's accompanied by a biodiversity crisis around the planet. We feed ourselves, but we starve the rest of life. That is a huge cultural shift, technological shift on our planet, and we need to understand it, because this has not yet happened through much of Africa. It's on the way, but we may yet avoid it. And the way that we've done this, the way that developed world has done this, is through incredible technological advances, investment, and effort. So it's sustained partly by these huge volumes of nitrogen in fertilizer, which is transported around the world. And one of the reasons I wanted to put this graph up, it shows immense ingenuity, immense investment, transport developments, logistics. We, right here on this university, we are training young people in the skills needed to support these systems and develop them further. In economics, people are being trained in how to extract more profit out of our lands and out of nature. In geography, people are being trained in how to interpret these sorts of these things. In engineering, people are being trained to develop the tools and the methods to extract even more value and profit out of the world around us. This university, and universities like it around the world, have produced the knowledge and the skills that has resulted in these sorts of trends. And it is a school for climate studies and a chair like yours, which needs to engage with the faculties who do the specialist thinking that produces these skills without thinking of the consequences. It's universities like ours that do this, and universities in Africa that do this. So that's a challenge. Maybe that's why it's so hard to get full collaboration from the other entities in a school like the School for Climate Studies. I'm sure it's not. So what's been happening? Where are we right now? And well, we've been very fortunate. All this training has had one major positive outcome. We use much less land now through technology to produce the food that we need. But it is a high technology dependence. Can we continue, is the question, and is that the right model for Africa? Another question. How will this new technology, how can we understand that technology and maybe shift and avoid the path that has been followed on the north and the south of those lines into the kind of development path that destroys biodiversity and things, and ecological sustainability. So, climate. That trend that I showed you of increasing agricultural production is now colliding with another trend. It is the trend of temperature change. And I've put up here the change in temperature in Africa. This is an act of global cultural self-harm second to none. We have been unable to stem this devastating trend, which is playing out across the planet and in Africa. The recent IPCC report, written by a massive team of African scientists, it's the best regional report in the IPCC. I urge you, download it. It's free on the web. Read it. Compare it to the other regional reports. It's the most insightful, the most in-depth, and the most culturally aware chapter of all the regional chapters. And we take on North America, South America, all of them. But this report shows that Africa already is feeling significant adverse impacts of climate change. This violent trend is committing violence on the continent of Africa. And we face imminent risks to biodiversity, human mortality and morbidity, and to crop production and food security. So the future of Africa, a better future for Africa, is at risk because of this trend. We need to understand it very, very well. Now, interestingly, Africa is responsible for less than 2%, fewer than 2% of the emissions of greenhouse gases that cause climate change. You would think we're least responsible as a continent. We're right in the path of the most adverse impact. Surely the international community through the UN would be helping Africa and building its science and its capacity to deal with this issue. Surely. They're wealthy. But this is the truth. This is also from the IPCC chapter. What you see on the left is the global funding in climate change science in blue, and the proportion that goes to Africa in red. And these are the good guys. It's astonishing to see these data. And the reason I show you graphs is to bring you along with the story, because words don't do justice to this graph. What's the consequence? I will point you to the right-hand side. The consequence is that African economies have to invest way more than the average global proportion of investment in climate change science. So you can see our investments in Africa are up to 11% versus a global average of creeping up to 4%. That is the cost to African economies for something which we did not cause. So we have to invest our own meager resources because the world has abandoned us. And if we look at where the funding to global change research, climate change research is going, it tells an even more pernicious story. Because the top 10 countries or institutions receiving funded for climate change research on Africa are not African. It's the US, UK, Germany, Sweden, France, Netherlands, Norway, Italy are ahead in terms of climate change research on Africa than Kenya and South Africa. We are in the back of the queue. And African efforts in international negotiations like the Paris Accord have not yielded the kind of benefits that we would expect. So these are the countries financing Africa-related climate research pre-2015, 1990 to 2015, and since then, different time periods. But there's no, except for the UK, it's on trend or less than before the Paris Accord. So the much-touted Paris Accord was a failure for Africa, for African science. So so what happens? Well, the implications are, Africa produces fewer than 2% of emissions, but what is the world focusing on? How can Africa's carbon sinks help to save the rest of the world? That's not in our interest. So we get advice on land use change. We get encouraged to plant trillions of trees in beautiful ecosystems which are without trees, afforestation. Eucalyptus from Australia being planted across African landscapes in a vain effort to capture carbon out of the atmosphere with huge implications for livelihoods for decades of Africans. Livestock management system advice, other agricultural practices, alternative energy systems, the imposition of ideology and culture onto Africa because of a lack of our own science and a lack of investment and lack of support. This is deeply, deeply wrong and incorrect. This means that our understanding of the trade-offs involved when countries make decisions about how to respond to climate change can very often be unintentionally flawed, deeply unintentionally flawed, with major adverse impacts on livelihoods for decades, destroying ecosystems, destroying water, destroying all sorts of other services. There are many examples. So, let me conclude. I would like to say that Southern Africa is approaching an era of sustainable development, potentially, with a healthy population, demographic, and economic outlook, if managed correctly. Our social ecological systems in Africa are at extreme risk of climate-related impacts, but not only the impacts, also inappropriate adaptation and mitigation responses imposed upon us by the rest of the world, especially with regard to land use. International funders severely underallocate support to this region, criminally underallocate support to this region, which is why this chair is so valuable. It's one of the few. So our region has to invest its own meager resources to maintain a world-class contribution to global knowledge. And it is world-class. Our chapter in IPCC was the best chapter. On those meager resources, we still managed to pull it out of the bag. That is an amazing effort. And it needs to be better rewarded because our science contributes to the global knowledge base on climate change impacts and adaptation. And we don't want to be the world's petri dish. We want to be equal partners. Southern African science, in particular, contributes substantively to the global knowledge on climate change. We're one of the main drivers of understanding in the Southern Ocean. That is 15% of the global carbon sink sits in the Southern Ocean, which is saving the world from global warming. We do all the research there. Millions and millions of rand we invest in understanding the Southern Ocean to our south. Very little support from the international community. And it's especially in terms of our understanding of the social biophysical systems and developing responses. So, a call to arms, call to action, and a call to the international community to wake up and help us more. Please. Thank you.